My name is Cami. I write as C.L. Walters. That's my maiden name. And I publish, or I've been writing for 20 some odd years. I attempted the traditional market by the query, the agent, the publisher for probably half of those. And the last 6 years, I jumped into independent publishing. So since I am an independent author, I work for myself. I own my own imprint. I opened a business, and that imprint is, I guess you could say, is my boss, because that imprint is going to guide basically all of my business decisions. And those business decisions are related to, what is this book going to be about? How is this book going to look when it goes onto the shelf? Because I make decisions about cover, about editing, about formatting, so everything. So I am my own boss. I set my own deadlines. All of that is my choice, but it also means my success is on me too, nobody else. I write mostly upper YA. So my protagonists are going to be anywhere from 17, 18, 19, 20. And that's kind of moving into new adult issues. So rather than kind of the coming of age of young adult, we're moving towards that coming of age of adulthood. And so my newest title, I have it sitting here, is In the Echo of this Ghost Town. And the kinds of characters I'm drawn to are complex characters, flawed characters. So my characters always generally have this little bit of edge to them. They're, for example, Griffin is the villain in my former book, The Story Stars Tell, and he's in it to this extent. There's this fight between him and the protagonist Tanner, and that's where it leaves off with Griffin. And I had a reader who said, I'm super interested in what happened with Griffin, because there was this moment and I just want to know more. So based on her comment, I couldn't get it out of my head and decided I need to explore this a little bit more. So I sat down and wrote that fight scene from Griffin's point of view, and I realized, oh my gosh, there's so much depth here. So that story really is about kind of the redemption of this young man who's making terrible choices and what that looks like, that growth over time. So really, those are the kind of books that you're going to get from a C.L. Walters young adult book. Great question. I started out actually writing adult titles, adult romance, because I've always adored adult romance. I mean, I grew up reading romance and I just loved it. So that's where I started. But I'm a teacher by trade. I spent 20 plus years teaching. And when Twilight came out, I read them and I was like, why am I not trying this? Because I think actually I have a lot of skills to be able to speak to this audience, given how much time I spend with this audience every day. And so that's what I started doing. And it was just a really good fit for me, because that's a really good fit for me as well as a teacher, that age group. So it just worked. I think the typical day in the life of this independent author is I'm up really early, usually around 5:30. Given the fact that I'm in Hawaii, there is that time difference. So I have to social post earlier, because if I want to get seen elsewhere, I need to make sure that I'm cognizant of time difference. So I'm usually posting on my socials ASAP. And then I spend some time getting myself centered for the day, whether it's through exercise or some reflection in my journal. And then I'm getting my family out the door, because I still have a family. So my husband and my son are off to work and school. My daughter is in college and she's just finally home because she just graduated. So she's home now. So there's a bunch of chaos that happens in my house. And then about from 8 a.m. to noon is really devoted to the business side of my writing. So that's doing blogs, doing newsletters, catching up on emails, interviews, because the time difference is usually an issue. So that's usually when I'm scheduling those kinds of things, if I have one. And then there's the planning. So I'll have planning or editing. I do side editing or whatever is on my plate as a business. And then the afternoon is devoted to the creative part of my writing. So I'm putting in probably 12 to 15-hour days, and I love it. I actually, when I was a teacher, I felt those 12 to 15-hour days. As a writer who owns her own business, I don't feel those 10 to 15-hour, 12 to 15-hour days like I used to. It's about being passionate, I think, about what you're doing. I think this is a great question. I think there's formal education that gives us tools that are useful in many, many respects. I don't necessarily think that formal education is necessary to be a writer, if that makes sense. I think it's helpful for sure. I don't know that it's necessary. And the reason I say that is because I think there are ways to get education that is not necessarily formal. So that's my little side. Do you need to have education to be a writer? I don't think so. I think it's helpful. My education, on the other hand, is I have my master's in education, curriculum and development, and my undergraduate was done in English. So I have English literature and writing. So I have a lot of tools in my toolkit that allow me to draw from what I have learned about story, about narrative, about editing, about grammar. So those kinds of things I think have been very helpful for me to be able to do what I do. Is it necessary? Probably not. There are people who are editors. There are people who are story developers. So, if you have a great idea and you have a passion to write something, I don't think that that should be the reason not to do it because you don't have the formal education. So I was writing stories and making up stories since I was a toddler, toddling about. My mom always talked about me always making up stories and play acting stories. But I wrote my first story when I was about 9. And I remember writing it, and I read it to my mother, who cried. And of course, she's my mother. She's definitely partial, but that response of being able to, it was so formative in who I was, in my identity, that I think it just carried over. That ability to create something that emotionally impacted someone else just really connected to me and became a singular thread through almost everything that I did beyond that. And so I've always been writing, and I knew that I wanted to share the stories. I knew I always wanted to be a published author. And it was a very, very long road between the very first novel that I wrote to finally self-publishing, because I struggled to get my foot in the traditional door, but I wasn't, at one point I did want to give up. I thought, well, I guess I'm just supposed to be a teacher. I had my Mr. Holland's Opus moment, and I was like, that's just who I am. And then my father passed away unexpectedly. And when you have one of those kind of visceral moments where you look in the mirror and you think, life is short, and am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing? And I knew that I hadn't fulfilled that one piece of me, that's that thread that needed to be addressed. And so I was like, I'm not going to take no for an answer this time. I'm going to do it myself. For me and the writing process, it's mostly solitary. So there is the drafting, that's all done on my own. And then I eventually reach out to readers to read to get feedback. So there's that facet of people that I work with. Then there's the cover artist. So there is some cooperation happening between me and that cover artist when I give her the synopsis of the story and the basic gist of things, and she puts together a cover and sends it back, and I'm like, I think maybe we need to tweak some of these pieces. I had this in mind, and then she'll take my feedback. So there's some cooperation happening. Same thing with an editor. So I do have an editor because you cannot catch all of your mistakes, even if you're an English major. And so I have an editor, and we kind of do kind of the same thing, that get that cooperation of back and forth. So there are people I work with, but I would say for the most part, it's a very solitary endeavor for me. I find actually that my life as a teacher has completely informed my life as a business owner slash author. There are so many skills that I took creating plans, then presenting those plans to people, creating accessible content for my students, having a plan in mind and then backward planning. All of these little skills that I developed doing that job have really informed my practice as a business owner and as an author, especially in an area that is not social media specifically, or I'm an introverted person with the ability to be extroverted. So it's not comfortable for me to put myself out there and say, hey, look at my book. Would you like to buy it? So there are things that being a teacher and those planning and things that have helped me with that part of the writing world that I didn't really knew existed as when I first started out. This is a very good question, and I feel like there's kind of two sets. There's a business side of the author, and then there's the creative side of the author, and I think both need different kinds of skill sets. I do think a couple of those things, if you're thinking of the creative side, it's a curiosity. You need to be curious. You need to be willing to ask questions. You need to be reflective and to be hungry to understand the human condition in a way that perhaps someone who isn't a writer wouldn't necessarily think about. You need to be a voracious reader because that is where you learn. When we talked about that formal education, it's that informal education of reading. So you need to be a reader. You need to be able to tell the truth fearlessly. So I think sometimes writers self-censor, given that they're afraid to hurt someone's feelings. You kind of can't do that as a writer because your job is to tell the truth, the honest truth, and to present humanity either in its worst form that will eventually become better, to highlight something, but also then maybe to create opportunity to grow and learn. So without telling the truth, you can't get there. So those are some of those. Oh, you have to be persistent and disciplined, because it's easy to say I'm going to write a book, but to actually put in the work to do it is the more difficult endeavor. And on the business side of things, I think and I guess this goes with the creative too, is you have to kind of have a thick skin, and you have to remember that not everybody's going to like what you write. So those 1-star reviews, or those reviews that say, I did not like this at all, those are so hard to hear because you've just put yourself out there, that truth. You've just told that truth and basically opened your heart for somebody to poke around in. But it's not for everybody. What you write is not for everybody. So I think those are some of the things. Maybe some more qualities on the business side is the persistence, being able to step outside your comfort zone because you have to sell it or it won't sell. My number one tool that I use constantly is my computer. So being familiar with different kinds of programs that work for you and are really good time-saving tools. So I've had to learn how to use different kinds of social media planning tools. I've had to learn how to use MailChimp in order to build a newsletter. I've had to learn to use Linktree so that I have the ability for people to click to links. I've had to learn to use Vellum, which is a software for ebooks formatting, and I've had to learn to use Word extensively because that's where I'm doing a lot of the formatting, because I don't hire my formatting out. If you are a designer, you have to understand how to use Adobe so that you can make your covers. If you're not hiring that out, there's a lot of stuff on a computer that I have access to, but that's pretty much my tool. And I haven't had that opportunity yet, just because since 2020, we've all really been locked at home. And I've been spending most of my last nearly 3 years marketing from home on my computer. So, and Zoom has made it much more easy to meet with people who are not in my time zone. But there are lots of conferences, there are book markets and festivals, there are book signings that are a part of that world that could be, just haven't. I did have some travel initially planned back in 2020, and then COVID hit and all that got mixed. So there are opportunities for it, but I don't know necessarily that it's necessary. I can speak mostly to being an indie author since I have not been traditionally published. Anything that I say about being traditionally published is going to be just based on the research that I've done in the marketplace. So keep that in mind as I answer. I think there are advantages to both, and I think there are disadvantages to both. As a traditional published author, you get to spend the majority of your time really focused on the creative endeavor of writing, because you have the benefit of an agent who's arguing for your sales and also lawyering for you, right? Being that entertainment lawyer for you. You have the traditional publisher who's doing the cover, the formatting, and you're really working with that editor to build out your book in terms of the creative process, the story itself. And then if you're of the fortunate group in those traditional published, you're going to get a budget for marketing, and you're going to get a publicist and the people who really kind of are pushing those things. That doesn't say that happens to all traditionally published authors. Not everyone gets that budget, and a lot of traditional published authors are having to do that on their own. In the independent world, I have, and I think this is a complete pro, the ability to choose everything for myself. I get to say in the cover, I get to say in the format, I get to say in whatever is created for the book itself. But I'm also writing it. I'm publishing it. I am publicizing it. I am marketing it. Everything is on me. And so that con, it's a pro, but it's also a con, is that everything is on me. And I have to remember that, recognizing that moving forward, if I want my book to go anywhere, it's on me. So I'm not sure. I think I like to look at it as a publishing journey, and that what fits each person has strengths and areas of growth that may work better for that traditional route to publishing, that traditional road. Or you may be that controlling kind of perfectionist that I find myself being, that really digs into the independent market. And what I love about what's happening in the publishing industry right now is that field is narrowing to come together to create one journey that authors are getting more empowerment to choose for themselves, which I think is a great pro. I would venture to say that book making and book selling is not necessarily a way to make a living. And I'm going to be frank with this answer. I was lucky in August, I made $7 on sales. And this is because, as an independent author who's having to front everything, because I'm investing in a business, this business is going to take time to build. So I'm building an authorship. And as the research that I've found has said, it takes a minimum of 5 books published before you begin to see any returns. So that means you've invested money in 5 books. That's 5 editors, 5 covers, 5 formatters, 5 however much it costs to make that book 5 times over. And then I'll begin to see profits. And that's when you'll begin to pay yourself back everything that you've already put into investing in that. So it's going to take probably another 5 books before you start putting that in, right? And it depends then, are those 5 books quality? Do people want to come back to read what you've written? Or do you know what I'm saying, right? Now, there are very different ways to approach this. There are authors in the traditional world that are making money. The traditional world is you sell it to you get an agent who then sells it. The agent takes 15% of your royalty or your commission, or that's their commission. So your royalty that the publisher pays you for your book in advance. They break that up into, I believe it's 3 payments. Then you get the first one, which is probably just, $1,000 to $2,000 to do what you need to do to write the rest of the book. Then you don't get the rest of that until your book sells. So until your book makes that advance back, then they release the rest of the sales and then royalties on top of that. So that's how the traditional world works. So if you're a mid-list author, and by mid-list, I mean you're not the bestseller, you're just the person who's like in the middle, who's just kind of plugging away in this world. I heard a TikTok recently of a mid-lister who said, I'm lucky if I'm making $8,000 a year on my book. So you don't get into this business really to be the best-selling author because it's rare to get there. Doesn't mean it can't happen, for sure. And there are authors on Kindle Unlimited who are cranking out 3 to 4 titles every year, who are making a pretty good living because they have a lot of people who are buying those books. So there are ways to make money as an author, but I think people have it in their head that they're the Stephen King, and that's not really what happens. So I have to make my money in other ways. So I love that I get to publish books, but I have a side gig, which is editing and book coaching and story development. And teaching. So those are some of the things that I'm doing to help supplement basically my book making habit. I think one of the stigmas around independent authorship is that for some reason independent books are subpar to traditionally published books. I think in that respect, that is one that definitely is a stigma that can impact the sales of a book. So when I'm making my books, my goal is always to make them look as if it could have been published by a traditional author or a traditional publishing house, because I want to be able to compete in that market. And I'm fighting against that stigma. That one I think is probably the biggest difficulty, a hurdle that you have to overcome as an independent author to be legitimately seen as an author. I do think that is changing a lot because you're having authors like Colleen Hoover, who is a traditionally published author, jump into that become a hybrid author by independently publishing. So her breakout hit Verity, she independently published. And because her publishing house was like, we're not going to publish this, it isn't your normal Colleen Hoover fare. So she said, fine, I'm going to do it myself. Did it. And now publishers picked it back up to republish it. So there are people, you're seeing that playing field level a little bit. But some of the more fun stigmas that aren't necessarily difficult to the work is when someone says, oh, you're a writer? Well, what else do you do? Because that's obviously not good enough. Or the one is, oh, I have a story for you. Maybe you should write it, as if that one's always fun as well. So there are some fun things that people will say when they find out that you're a writer. For me, it's that personal fulfillment. Like I mentioned, that thread of my identity is really tied up in writing. So the fact that I get to sit down every day and write stories and talk to characters and present this as a means of enjoyment for someone else, that's magic to me. That's my favorite thing about being a writer and being an author. Reviews are hard. So as much as you want to like just let them kind of flow over you, when you do get a negative review, that's difficult, because when I was a teacher and I had a complaint, for example, if I had a parent who's like, I don't like this assignment or whatever, I didn't take it personally, right? It was whatever it was. It was what it was. We could address it. We could figure that out. When you're writing, you're putting yourself out for someone, and it does feel like a personal, I don't want to say attack, because I know it's not. It's a judgment of, feels almost like a judgment of you as a human being, and because it's your creativity. So I think that's probably one of the hardest things to face as a writer, as an author. And then the discipline. So when life gets in the way, the discipline of sitting down to write, when you're facing grief, or you're facing, those difficulties. I know a lot of writers struggled through 2020 because it was really hard to focus. So those kinds of things, there are always going to be obstacles that get into your path. And as a writer, you have to find, if that's your job, you have to find ways to, and tools to help yourself write through some difficult things sometimes. When I was younger and more idealistic and naive, I do used to think it was just about the writing. So if I had known that I would have to do all the marketing and all the social media, of course, social media didn't exist then, but if I had to do all those things, I probably could have approached it a little bit differently. I also did everything wrong when I first jumped into independent authorship. I just jumped in. I did my research, but it was all so conflicting that it was too hard to understand and siphon through everything to get to the heart of what I needed to know. So I jumped in and did everything wrong. So, but experience is the best teacher. And that's kind of what I've done, is it's taught me, and I found reputable resources and put that together. But I think those are probably the two things that I will have to market my work. And I wish I had a resource to help me, guide me when I started independent publishing. Well, when I was teaching, I'm not teaching full-time anymore. So it's fabulous. I get to be a full-time writer. But when I was teaching, I had to balance the home life, teaching life, and writing life. So I really kind of set aside time as a writer when I was doing that was devoted to writing. And my family knew that's untouchable time. And I knew for myself that I couldn't put teaching stuff into that time. So I had to set time up that was going to allow me to attack the writing life. Now I don't have that so much. So now I have to force myself to close the computer, to stop writing, to stop work, so that I'm focused on my family. Because it would be very easy for me. I'm one of those personalities that once I get going, it's really hard for me to stop. So I have to set an alarm. It is now 6 p.m. Turn everything off. When I think about my students, I think there are clearly people who are like, writing is not for me. I will never be a writer. I hate it, because they hate just the act of writing in and of itself. Then you have those people who are like, I absolutely adore writing essays, writing stories, talking story, whatever it is. And those people are they are kind of drawn to that. I do think you need to like writing, because you're going to be writing. So I think that should be something. But then there are people that I've talked to who have come to writing later in their life, that it wasn't something that they really enjoyed doing until they were older, until after they'd gone through school and they started work and they were in their working life, and they were like, I have a story that I really want to tell. And it isn't until they're in their later 20s, early 30s, even sometimes later 40s, 50s, that they're like, I want to write this down. And they start writing. So, the thing about writing is it doesn't have to happen in your 20s or your teens. So you can start writing when you're in your 70s. There is no rules about writing in that respect. I think graphic arts is one, and two jobs that come to mind specifically with graphic arts is cover design and format or book design. That's what you get between the pages. Both of those are graphic arts related. Then you also have social media. So there are authors who hire social media consultants, and they're doing all the graphic arts for their social media. They're doing the social media posts. They're doing those kinds of things. There are assistants who work with authors who have that kind of thing in their budget. Those are the people that are helping with research. Those are the people that are helping with fielding phone calls, calling bookstores, with the tours, whatever. You have the agent or a book agent. I do think this job requires the love of reading. They will have to read a ton and then try to find the next big thing, basically, and all the kinds of things that are being submitted to them. And that's who they're hiring and then book shopping. So you'd have to be a very good people person because you are dealing with people. There are editors. So you're not writing, but you are correcting. These are very detail oriented people. They are looking at writing, finding the mistakes or finding the story elements that need to be developed. There are there's so many jobs, publicists, there's the bookseller. There's so many places if you love, and then there's, well, how could I forget the librarian? So people who aren't writing but just love being surrounded by books and reading and offering books. Yeah, there's all kinds of jobs. And those are the only ones that I know about. I'm sure there's more. Entertainment law. So. Yes, I would say I have two bits of wisdom for you. One, don't begrudge the process, because as you're moving through your life and as you're moving through your jobs, and perhaps you're in a career that is not necessarily one that you chose for yourself, but you've kind of fallen into it, there are little nuggets and golden treasures in each day that you can take that probably will help you in your future, that maybe you don't necessarily see right then, but will become more apparent as you move through your process. So that journey is really important to get you from one place to the other. I think sometimes one of the things I remember doing when I was younger was wishing I was where I wanted to be. So I wish I was the best-selling author already. And I think that wishes away that journey, but it also wishes away your life. And that piece of advice I would say is to take each day and accept this day and the fact that this day is going to contribute to who you are and that eventual goal. And it's so important to sit in that and see that moment as a gift for what it is. So those were my two bits of advice. As a writer and 20 years old, and I was very, arrogant in my my early 20s. I think I was 21 probably. And I read advice that was Stephen King saying, you must read. And I was like, I just want to write. I don't need to read, but you learn so much by reading. So